Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with your host, Mr. Ancharsky. This is Chapter 2 of Unit 6 of the class that I'm teaching, AP World. Yes. So today we're going to look at our first kind of more concrete example of European colony building during the age of new imperialism. So we're going to take a look at India actually today. So bell work on the screen right there. Identify one change and one continuity in interactions of Africa and Europe during between the age of colonization and the age of new imperialism. So what's one change? What's one continuity? So let's take a look at India today. India is going to be, at least for us, our first example of this age of new imperialism, and it is going to embody a lot of those trends that I mentioned in this very first video of this particular series. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So you're going to see today kind of that power dynamics are going to shift across the period we'll talk about today between about the 1600s to 1914, so almost 300 years of world history today. So kind of generally, we do see changes in the political influence on the Indian subcontinent and in the Indian Ocean basin as a whole. So today's lesson objective, you should kind of use this time to compare to another place in the age of new imperialism, perhaps in Africa or other parts of Asia, maybe even Latin America or China, even though those places are independent. So let's go ahead without further ado. Let's get started. And indeed, yes, we are going to cover almost a 300-ish year period of world history today, and that is quite a lot. But we kind of are, again, in this class, mostly doing broad, general overviews of huge events in world history. That's kind of the disadvantage of world. That's why you should have taken Euro, quite frankly. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So, where are we in terms of Indian history? When did we last talk about India? Leave it in the comments below. I'm just kidding. So, let's take a look at where we last left off with India. So, as you might remember, the last time we talked about India, at least in terms of a more full-length lesson, was back in Unit 3. Unit 3, oh my gosh, holy cow. Anyway, so we are going to look at kind of the end of the Mughal Empire a little bit today. And back in Unit 3, we talked about different reasons for the decline of the Mughal Empire. A few of them include political conflicts. Some of them include financial and economic difficulties. But today we're going to kind of look at the thing that's going to finally end the Mughal Empire. And that is going to be the rise of British imperialism. But I'm going to kind of overview just some highlights of the decline of the Mughal Empire and kind of how the British are working their way into India. So as you might remember, back with our discussion of the Mughal Empire, compared to the other gunpowder empires, compared to the Ottomans and the Safavids, the Mughals were more decentralized. It's very difficult, as you are kind of seeing in world history, for there to be a centralized state encompassing all of the Indian subcontinent. It's very difficult for that to happen. And the Mughals, even though they're the most successful, you could argue, there are going to be a lot of internal conflicts, a lot of internal political decentralization that does lead to the decline of the empire. So we do see that the empire by the 1700s really is starting to come apart. We do have the rise of prominent local kingdoms. These kingdoms ruled over by Nawabs, they are in theory supposed to answer to the Mughal emperor. And yet they are kind of their own princely states. They are their own independent areas. So we do kind of see that India is becoming kind of fragmented, if you will. Even though technically there's a Mughal emperor, India is kind of breaking up into smaller regional states. And the reason why this is significant, not just that it will help us explain what the administrative structure of colonial India will look like, but it also helps us explain how India is going to become imperialized, how we do see the rise of British imperialism. There's no centralized state to resist all of this encroachment. So we do have this political fragmentation as a part of the Mughal Empire's decline. But we also got the Zamindars as well, another good example that kind of ties in with some of the things we're going to see it here today. One part of the Mughal Empire's administration were the Zamindars. The Zamindars were tax-collecting nobles, basically. They were nobles in the Mughal Empire, Muslim, mostly Muslim, who did have some political privileges granted to them in exchange for collecting taxes for the Mughal emperor. The Mughal emperor provided some sort of salary to these nobles, and the nobles had land as well in exchange for all of this. But the thing about the Zamindars is that they do tend to kind of want to work for the person who pays them the most amount of money. So, as the Mughal Empire is declining, economic instability, political fragmentation, we do see that the Zamindars increasingly are going to look elsewhere for people to work for so that they can have money. So keep that in the back of your mind for a second. But finally, kind of another hallmark of the decline of the Mughal Empire is going to be a transition of economic control away from India itself towards European trading empires. So to kind of bring us back to the age of colonization real quick, the presence of of the Europeans in India, really before the 1750s, I should say, is mostly going to be trade post empires. We see a whole bunch of different European powers establish trading colonies, those merchant enclaves, those trade posts. They all mean the same thing across the Indian coast. They include the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch. Those are the big ones I can think of. But we also have the British as well, who are going to kind of be one of our main characters of today. So the British East India Company is going to be one of these several European powers that is going to establish trade posts along the coast of India by the 1600s at the earliest. But as it becomes the 1700s, these trade posts are going to become more and more prevalent along the coast of India. However, a few things before we look at kind of how these trade posts will expand inland. First, before 1750, really before the Industrial Revolution, most of these trade post territories were gained through money or diplomatic negotiations. It's important to kind of remember that the Industrial Revolution is what gives Britain, in this case, and Europe in general, the advantage over societies in Africa and Asia, was the Industrial Revolution. And we do see that mostly because before the Industrial Revolution, India and Europe and other parts around the world kind of on the same playing field in terms of military technology. However, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, things are going to change, as we'll see in a second. So let's take a look at that change. How is the British East India Company going to acquire more and more influence over India? And before I continue, actually, it is worth noting that the British East India Company was a chartered company. So it had government approval by the British back in Great Britain. But it was, for the most part, a private company. It did have stockholders. I guess it is a public company then. So it did have stockholders. It wasn't owned directly by the British government, although there's a lot of close interconnections between them. So essentially, we are going to see in just a second how a company, I should say, acquires an empire. It's very ridiculous when you think about it, but let's look at how that happens. Well, we do see that as the Mughal Empire declines, inversely, we do see the rise of the British East India Company. And we're going to see the British East India Company emerge as the dominant European power and eventually the dominant political influence on the Indian subcontinent as a result of a few things. One of them is going to be the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was a huge war that lasted 9 years, and it's called the 7 Years' War for some reason. Oh, never mind. Yeah. So we do see the 7 Years' War as this international conflict, mostly for territories in the New World, but there's also going to be fighting over in India as well between all basically the European powers. And what do you know it? Who comes out on top? It's going to be the British. The British government sends over their military to help out the East India Company, basically kick out the Portuguese and the French and the Dutch. So the British, well, I should say that there are still at least some Portuguese and French coastal areas, but for the most part, the dominant power is the British. So the British are going to kind of emerge as the dominant European trading power in India. So that's one way we do start to see British East India Company influence emerge and rise. But another way is going to be actually more inland territory that the East India Company will achieve. So there is going to be this battle that's kind of a part of the 7 Years' War. It's going to be a conflict between one of these regional kingdoms in the area of Bengal, so modern-day Bangladesh, and we do see that the British East India Company gets into a war with this regional kingdom. Guess who wins? Well, it's the British. So at the Battle of Plassey, we do see the British East India Company acquire inland territory, but also it acquires the right to collect taxes in this specific region of India. And this kind of sets off a chain reaction. Other places owned by the British East India Company elsewhere in India are going to also be administered by this company. So really, we are going to see that as a result of this increased influence, as a result of the ability to collect taxes, the ability to use the zamindars to collect taxes, for example, we do see that power is shifting away from the Mughal Empire to the British. I should say, the British East India Company. And we're going to look at it in just a second. How does this company actually administer India? But kind of this image right here at the bottom kind of describes that a little bit, because these East India Company individuals, they're going to rule over India as if it were their own country. They're going to kind of view themselves as regional kings, as these princely states. So let's take a look at generally how does the British East India Company administer this part of the world? Well, how do you back up your rule if you are a government anywhere in world history? You need a military force. So who is going to compose this military force? Well, it's going to be a group of Indians who are hired by the British East India Company, known as the Sepoys. The Sepoys are Muslim and Hindus from India, and they are going to be individuals who are paid by the British East India Company to serve as colonial militia units, basically. They have white officers, so it's not like they have a complete degree of independence. But we do see the Sepoys are going to be a major part of colonial administration under the East India Company, and they kind of also continue as well under the British when the government actually takes over, but we'll look at that in a second. So we got the Sepoys. The Sepoys are one way that their rule is backed up. But we also see that as a part of colonial administration, there's not that much in terms of kind of changing society, changing the political structure per se, more so kind of using already existing structures like the zamindars to collect taxes. And these taxes are going to be collected in the form of cash crops, in the form of raw materials. And these cash crops include a variety of different things. One of the biggest is opium, Opium is a type of drug which is smoked out of flute-like thingies. They kind of look like clarinets, actually. That's me. That's not. I've never been to an opium den. Let me just be clear about that. But it's just based on historical readings and pictures and artifacts. Anyway, opium. Why do they want to grow opium? Do they like drugs? Do they want to sell drugs to the British people? No, actually, they don't. They want to sell drugs to the Chinese. And we'll look at that more later, actually. So opium is a big cash crop, a big raw material from India. Cotton as well. Why do they want cotton? Well, they want a place to have cotton for textiles. India is a place that has great textile, or I should say, cotton production. And actually, we do see that kind of things are shifting, kind of starting to shift in India. Even though India was a dominant textile producer before 1750, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, as a result of the dominance of new institutions like the British East India Company, things are starting to shift away from industrialization. So we do see cotton, opium, tea, that's the thing the British public wants. And also some of this rice plantations are made in order to feed these cash crop places. However, the big problem with creating a society, an economy, almost exclusively based on raw material production of cash crops, is that that is going to kind of not free up enough land for food production. So we do see that as a result of this British East India Company's policies, there is going to be a massive famine. Especially hard hit is the region of Bengal. In the 1700s, the late 1700s, we see this massive famine. I believe the death toll is around 8 million. So it is a horrible example of how these policies are leading to devastation among native Indians. But we do see that kind of the British East India Company is, at the end of the day, a company. A company exists to make money. And we do see that kind of this incentive, of money production of money generation, I should say, does lead to massive amounts of corruption. It leads to very high taxes. So we do see that kind of these are underlying issues, tensions between native Indians and the British. So we do see the kind of the British East India Company, they are using already existing local administrative structures like the zamindars to collect these taxes. And we do see the kind of, this is going to encourage a lot of hostility to the East India Company. It's causing unrest, it's causing this terrible famine, but we also do see that the racial and religious prejudices of the British East India Company, especially the white colonial officials, that also leads to further tensions. And we are going to see that actually best expressed in the Sepoy Rebellion. It's sometimes called the Indian Revolution. It technically could go in that unit that we just had about the Age of Revolutions, and yet it's more fitting with this particular unit. So what is the Sepoy Rebellion? Well, the Sepoy Rebellion was a massive uprising of these sepoys that were hired by the British East India Company. The immediate kind of cause of it is a little disturbing and very sacrilegious, unfortunately. The British East India Company wanting to kind of make their bullets and their ammunition more efficient. The white officers would tell their sepoy ranks to dip their bullets in cow or pig fat, which is especially religiously taboo for Hindus and Muslims. So we do kind of see that there will be this massive uprising. It does threaten British East India Company's holding over India. And this actually does lead to kind of a change in the administrative body that rules over India. And that is going to actually be the transition away from company rule to rule directly by the British government. So one of the big results of the Sepoy Rebellion is that in order to put it down, the British East India Company has to get on the telegraph And they have to ask the British government to send in military troops to help restore order. However, kind of this is the final straw in many ways for the British East India Company. The government, the Parliament of Great Britain, is going to realize, oh my God, we can't take this anymore. You guys are causing social unrest. There's rebellion. There's famine. You guys are obviously insanely corrupt. We need to step in and take over. And that indeed is what's going to happen in the Government of India Act of 1857, same year as the Sepoy Rebellion. And essentially, under the British, under this Government Act, we are going to see a transition of what body rules over India. And that is going to be introducing us to our next period of Indian history called the British Raj. The British Raj does describe this period between the Sepoy rebellions ending to 1947, the date of Indian independence. And this is going to introduce us to the direct British government control over a large part of the Indian subcontinent. So the British Raj is different from the company rule because who's in charge? It's the big government, the big cheeses back in London. So let's kind of see how the British Raj is going to rule over India. Well, first, let's kind of look at the political structure of India as a result of this Government of India Act and future pieces of legislation. Well, for one thing, we are going to see a division of India into different areas. Some areas will be directly ruled by the British government back in Great Britain, back in London. But other parts are going to be what we call princely states. These are independent countries within India that are, well, when I say independent, I should say independent. They are going to be regional states ruled over by Indian princes that are going to enter diplomatic negotiations with the British that they keep their self-government. In exchange, the British have the right to pass their military through their lands. They have the right to collect taxes. So we do see that there will be some dependent princely states. That's what we generally call these areas. But for the most part, at the end of the day, who's really in charge is the British government back in London. So there's that political reorganization. But we do kind of see other ways that the British Raj is introducing changes into Indian society, or at least attempting to introduce changes. And we see this expressed in a variety of different ways. For one thing, there's Westernization. Westernization essentially is the introduction of European ideas of gender, of race, of education. So these sorts of things are coming into India. The British are actively trying to promote the adoption of more European customs by Indians. So we do see the introduction of these more westernized ideas, ideas of class, ideas of gender and race, but also ideas of government as well. We do see the building of small local government that is structured along kind of British models of political systems, on political British models, I should say. Of local elections, not kind of national elections, although there will be kind of there will be national elections, actually, come to think of it. But we do see that kind of Westernization does see the incorporation of a lot of Western European ideas of government, culture, and the economy. And speaking of the economy, stupid, that's a quote from Bill Clinton, we do see this idea of modernization as well. Modernization, the introduction of industrial infrastructure like railroads, improved harbors, canals, these sorts of things. They're going to be introduced into India as a way to kind of encourage more efficient raw material extraction. So there's a similarity between the Raj and the company, is the idea of raw material extraction. Then we have something called Anglicanization. Essentially, this is the introduction of English as a language, the introduction of Anglicanism as a religion, the introduction of more specific British customs, ideas of aristocracy and class. These things are coming into India as well, the British model of these things. So that under the British Raj, we do generally see an attempt to change the societal, economic, and political fabric of Indian society. Kind of related to that economic point I brought up earlier, we do see that, again, the big goal of the British in general is to open up raw materials extraction points, but also, of course, to provide markets for manufactured goods. Those are the two big reasons why our boys in Europe are going to colonize the world. We do see that in order to encourage more raw material production, we do see the building of industrial infrastructure like railroads. And again, remember, the building of economic infrastructure, industrial infrastructure in Africa and Asia during the 1800s is mostly a way to centralize political authority over, or I should say, political and economic hegemony or authority over a region. So we do see the building of some infrastructure to encourage raw material extraction even faster, but we do see very active attempts to tear down literally, the industrial infrastructure of a formerly major textile producer. There is an active effort to discourage things made in India. So we do see that kind of high tariffs will be placed on back in Great Britain on goods coming from India, especially manufactured goods mostly. So that's kind of one way things are being discouraged, this kind of forcing of new legal idea, this kind of creation of a new political system, of a new economic system, but also the raising of tariffs back in Great Britain to prevent industrialization, or at least to limit it. So we do see that India is going to shift away from being a dominant textile producer to becoming a dominant manufacturing importer. So there's a big change in global overseas history, for one thing. But much like we do see with these political and economic efforts to kind of change Indian society, we also do see the British are introducing ideas of social hierarchy, some new ones based on European ideas, but also reinforcing and kind of reworking some old ones. Well, we do see that at the end of the day, what class dominates India? It's going to be British people. It's going to be British settlers, British colonial administrators, the British governor, all of these people who came over from England to administer government over in India. These are considered the elite, and everyone that supports them, that's white, they're going to be considered the elite as well. So that's kind of one way that the British are going to dominate the social hierarchy, but they're also going to actively encourage the adoption of British religion, of Anglicanism, I should say, of English as a language, of British social customs. So there is going to be this, I say this phrase a lot, there is going to be this kind of big attempt to try and westernize, to try and anglicize India. There's a reason why India is a major English language speaker to this day. It's because of these efforts by the British to establish social control over their colonies. And we do see that this kind of Anglicanization will mostly affect elites. And that actually leads us to our second point, actually. We do see that in order to centralize authority even more, we do see a misinterpretation of a lot of already existing social hierarchies. Obviously, very wealthy and noble people are going to be kind of preferred by the British. And there is going to be this creation of a reinforcement, I should say, of the already existing caste system. The caste system is going to become more standardized across all of India. It kind of goes against that more decentralized, very spread out nature of earlier Hinduism. We do see that it's going to be kind of legally imposed in many cases. There is going to be a set structure of caste. upper caste people tend to be more preferred because of their kind of social standing already existing in Indian society. Also, ideas of race are going to somehow work their way in there, and they're going to say, oh, these upper caste people, they are the original Aryans. And we, as British people, we are Aryans ourselves, so they must be closer to us than those lower caste people. That's me being a British racist right there. Anyway, so they have this caste system that's being reinforced, and it's based on weird race science. But we also do see this kind of preference for different religions and different treatment of different religions in India. There is going to be this kind of preference for elite caste members in Hindu society. And in some areas, there is going to be a preference for Hindu local elites at the expense of Muslims, actually. And kind of the reason why they are encouraging these ethnic divisions, they're preferring upper caste Hindus over other people, is kind of a reaction to the Sepoy Rebellion in many ways. In creating these social hierarchies, in creating these points of division within society, it does kind of refocus a lot of people's anger away from the British. So because of the reinforcement of this rigid caste system and these religious and ethnic divides, we do see an attempt to try and basically negate nationalism. And we'll look at that in just a second, actually. But you should be able to at least compare between the company rule and the British Raj. How are they similar? How are they different? So let's look at kind of some general impacts of the British Raj. One of them is actually going to be the development of the Indian middle class. Remember, the British are introducing ideas of economics, ideas of social class, and this kind of does lead to the creation of a new class of people in India, the Indian middle class. These are going to be elite local Indians who are going to work their way into government, actually, at least into lower government jobs. So this this Indian middle class is going to really be very westernized, very anglicized. They send their kids to university. They face racial discrimination, obviously, but they are going to kind of see and adopt a lot of British customs in an effort to kind of preserve their social standing. And we'll look at that impact in just a second. But one way we do see kind of this new class of people having some political influence in colonial government is through the Indian civil service. So the Indian civil service, that's Indian colonial government. There are white imperial controllers in a lot of these different parts of the Indian civil service, but a lot of the lower jobs are going to be filled with native Indians, actually. And this kind of picture right here, I believe this is the mail department of a major Indian city. I think probably Mumbai. That was one of the main administrative centers. This is going to actually be a good representation of this idea of white bosses, of white leaders in these civil service areas, and then everybody else, mostly Indians from the middle class. So we do kind of see a growing resentment that will become more prominent in the 20th century between these Indian middle-class people who believe they should have control over their own society and their British bosses, basically. We also see other social changes as well. Some of them are going to be aimed essentially at trying to eliminate Indian culture, Indian customs. Some of them for kind of better in a way. We do see the end of some traditional practices. The one that I mean by the better, that's sati, the idea of ritual widow burning. I don't like burning widows. But anyway, we do have this ending of this traditional practice. It's seen as quote unquote barbaric. But we do kind of see that there are more nefarious things the British are doing to try and reduce the influence of native Indian culture, native Indian traditions. One of them is trying to promote English language. So there is going to be kind of this imposition of English language, but also of British ideas of race and class and gender. And we do see that those same problems of race and class and gender divisions in Europe that we talked about last unit, they're going to kind of apply now as well to India. So that is a long-term effect of imperialism, you could say, this idea of imposing these customs from Great Britain, ideas of gender, ideas of race, ideas of class. That's going to be a major long-term impact, kind of a standardization, if you will, around the world of our notion of class division. However, we do kind of see that a result of this class division is going to be a lot of tensions within society over things like wealth. There's a lot of poverty in India, but we also do see that encouragement of ethnic and religious divisions leads to tensions between the two major groups religiously in India of Hindus and Muslims. And that'll be kind of a long-term thing that we'll see in the future, actually. So keep that in the back of your mind, that there are these colonial tensions. The British favored one over the other. That led to a lot of resentment. That led to a lot of feelings of superiority by one certain class over the other. But we also do see that the British Raj, in its economic effects on India, so this is actually the DBQ last year, not directly India, but economic effect of imperialism, is that it is going to lead to the discouragement of industrialization, the encouragement of this import economy rather than a export, or rather than a exporting country of manufactured goods. So importing manufactured goods rather than making them themselves. We do see this mostly through the preferential treatment given to British companies. We also see this in how the British government will have high tariffs on manufactured goods from India. And that does lead to a lot of Indian businesses going out of business, going bankrupt, because they can't compete with how cheap and how quickly produced British materials are. So again, remember, the reason why manufacturing declines in Asia isn't because Europe has better goods. It isn't because their goods are of superior quality. It's because of the fact of imperialism, for one thing, but also the fact that England can produce its goods so much more quicker, so much more cheaply, thanks to new things like mechanization and mass production. So that is going to see kind of a big long-term impact on India. India to this day, India is industrialized now, of course, thanks to things that we'll talk about in the future. But we do see that kind of a big long-term effect is that for much of Indian history, it is going to be mostly not industrialized. It is going to become an export economy, meaning it exports raw materials, things like, again, cotton, silk, and tea, and opium. This video, at least the first half of it, kind of talks about this increased ethnic divisions between Muslims and Hindus. One example of that is that religious groups in local elections could only vote for members of their religious group. And that kind of leads to this idea of, oh, we have our vision of what Indian culture is. We have our vision of what Indian culture is, mostly along ethnic and sometimes racial and religious lines. However, kind of another long-term impact of the British Raj is going to be the development of nationalism, actually. Nationalism is going to be, of course, one of the major results, one of the major effects of imperialism, because it is going to be one way people in Africa and Asia are going to try and resist European occupation. So let's take a look at the birth of Indian nationalism. Where does it come from? Well, ironically enough, it's going to emerge among that Indian middle class that I talked about earlier. That Indian middle class is made up of westernized Indians who are influenced by things like the Enlightenment and nationalism. They are going to use these ideas and they are going to start thinking maybe some change can be made. We're benefiting right now from colonial administration for the most part, but we could be on top if we were given more government jobs, if we were given more home rule, if we were given more kind of local autonomy. So we do kind of see that there will be this push by members of the Indian middle class, nationalists specifically in the Indian middle class, who believe that their class of people, they should be the ones in charge of India. So let's kind of take a look at one of the first early examples of that. Well, the first political organization to emerge to try and encourage nationalism amongst Indians of varying ethnicities and races and religions is going to be the Indian National Congress, the INC. The INC is still around today. I think it's the one of the largest political parties in the modern day. But at the time, the INC was a nationalist group that believed, however, not in independence right now, but at the very least, the idea that there shouldn't be white employers, white government officials at the expense of local Indians. So there is going to be a movement to try and kind of get rid of the royal governor so that India could be a it could be a colony that had self-government, that had home rule. However, we do see that this INC is going to be mostly modest in its demands for change until World War I. World War I is kind of a changing point in terms of the history of imperialism, because World War I does tend to be the start of a lot of anti-colonial struggles. And the reason for that is kind of a little bit messed up, because during World War I, as we'll talk about more in Unit 7, European nations are going to promise their colonies that in exchange for cooperating, in exchange for sending over military supplies and soldiers during the war, we'll give you independence. And guess what? Never trust an English person. India did not get its independence. So we do kind of see that this denial of independence is going to radicalize more people in India to try and make a nationwide movement to declare independence. And that actually leads to figures like Mohandas Gandhi right here. Gandhi was a member of the Indian middle class who was a nationalist. I think he studied in South Africa, which was a British colony at this time. He was a lawyer. So he is a respectable middle class guy, and he is influenced by ideas of nationalism. And he's going to be one of the kind of early figures that will help spearhead an eventual independence movement. So World War I kind of is the start of a lot of anti-colonial movements. That's generally kind of what to get with that. And we'll talk about Gandhi more later on. This is an early picture of him. And you can see, look, he's adopted Western standards. He has well, obviously, non-British anglicized Indians have mustaches, but he's wearing a suit and tie. He's got this hair in the British fashion right here. So we do kind of see that there will eventually be the birth of pro-independence nationalist movements. The problem, however, is disagreements over what is the best way to declare independence, and for who, what ethnic groups, what religion. We'll come back to that more later in Unit 8. All right, so that's India. Let's look at other places in Britain's empire. So first, general overview. We are going to see that the British are heavily interested in trade, as always. Britain, as you remember, very industrialized nation, and it is going to be kind of one of the first to engage in overseas imperialism, mostly out of this desire for raw materials and a place to sell manufactured goods. But the Industrial Revolution is going to kind of increase the desire for overseas trade, as we do see new technologies like the steamship, like copper bottom plating on boats. We've got the copper bottom boats, textiles with the cotton. The whole of India was owned by her being Queen Victoria. All right. No one likes that. All right, so let's keep going. So a big interest in trade, of course, a big promotion of industrialization, of industrialism. That's an economic ideology that motivated imperialism. But we also do see that another big kind of motivation for the British and other places is going to be the idea of creating kind of markets for colonial goods, but all for manufactured goods, I should say, but also kind of to build protective choke points on trade, to kind of have areas to secure militarily the prized possessions of the British Empire. So in order to kind of defend India, that's really kind of what will influence a lot of the other colonies that Britain will build and will establish across the Indian Ocean. So, for example, a lot of presence in East Africa, mostly to secure that area, so that trade could be safe to get to India. Also, the Suez Canal in 1867, that's going to be a big area that's gotten to secure trade to India. But also there'll be colonies gained to secure trade to China as well. Singapore is the best example of that. But let's take a look at kind of what free trade means to the British. And this kind of gets a little bit confusing because I am kind of emphasizing a big difference between the age of imperialism and the age of colonization is free trade versus mercantilism. So we do kind of see that the British economic philosophy is going to be motivated by those ideas of laissez-faire, but in practice, it kind of does sound like mercantilism. So in theory, Britain is motivated by ideas of laissez-faire. It certainly is in places like China, in areas of economic imperialism. But we do see that kind of the big thing that's motivating is attempts to remove any restrictions on foreign trade that other countries might have, other societies might have. So we do see that there will be this kind of use of government to create favorable conditions for private companies to do business in colonies, which is a huge mouthful to say, but I'll say it one more time. The role of government during the age of imperialism is to create the conditions for private companies to do business overseas. So in their colonies and a lot of these local governments, they're going to explicitly deny the ability to pass tariffs, for example, any taxes on British manufactured goods. We also do see that kind of there is this difference between mercantilism and free trade, in that during the age of colonization, there tends to be state-run corporations, whereas during the age of imperialism, this is mostly private businesses, private companies doing business in overseas areas. So the role of government is to create the conditions for private companies to do business overseas. And that's true in areas of informal imperialism and formal imperialism as well. And again, obviously, why is Britain making colonies? Raw materials, manufactured goods selling. All right, so we do see that kind of a lot of the things that will motivate British imperialism in the Indian Ocean is mostly, again, going to be securing commerce to India or China. So why is Great Britain involved in Egypt? Well, it's to build the Suez Canal. Why do they want a Suez Canal? To get to India a lot quicker. Why did they take South Africa back in 1814? Well, at the time, before there was a Suez Canal, it was a stopping point to get to India. So we do kind of see that a lot of the decisions to build colonies in places like East Africa and in the Middle East and down here in South Asia, mostly to get to India or China. So Cape Colony, aka South Africa, Singapore as well. Singapore controls the Strait of Malacca. It never goes away, my friends. So the Strait of Malacca, a major stopping point for trade going to China. If you want to sell your opium in China, you grow it in India, then you send it down here to the Strait of Malacca, and then you go over here to China. Assam, which is a region in kind of modern day India, and then Myanmar, that was built to kind of defend India. Again, always defend India. That's a British motivation there. Defend India from the dreaded French over here in Indochina, modern day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And we'll talk about the Afrikaners more later, actually. All right, so that's kind of a big motivation for why other British colonies will be built in the Indian Ocean, secure trade with China and India, to create marketplaces for manufactured goods, to build up a demand for manufactured products in those places to get raw materials. However, let's look at the other places of the British Empire, and then we are going to kind of look at the kind of thing that makes Australia and New Zealand unique in world history. All right, so Canada, New Zealand, and Australia are all three examples of white settler colonies. These are places where a significant white population lives, and these places are going to be kind of different from places in Africa or, Asia, in the sense that there isn't going to be a royal governor. In fact, they are going to be given self-government. They're going to be given home rule, as it's called. They're still a part of the British Empire. However, day-to-day administration is more trusted with these local officials, actually, who happen to be white, actually. So there's a racial dynamic there. So these settler colonies, they tend to kind of copy and paste what goes on in Great Britain. It kind of is an example of the diffusion of European ideas of politics, of the economy, of class, of society. Parliamentary governments are established in all three of these places. So a system in which there's election for representatives and parliament and prime ministers and whatnot. All of these places speak English. Well, if you can call Australian British English. Anyway, so we have the adoption of British culture. They have self-government. This is different, however, from areas with mostly non-white populations that have a royal governor. So you can kind of see what makes these three places unique, again, being Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Canada, you don't need to know anything about Canada, actually. It's British by 1763 as a result of the 7 Years' War. Geez, wow. Australia. So here's some things to listen to about Australia, and I'll emphasize the most important thing. The most important thing to know about Australia and the South Pacific in general is that the interactions between Europeans and people in the South Pacific are most similar to interactions between Europeans and the Americas back in the 1500s. And let me explain what I mean by that, because they're most similar in the sense that we do have this kind of exploration of these areas. These were areas where it was difficult to do continuous overseas contact with until the Industrial Revolution. And we do kind of see that there will be similar patterns of interactions, especially in the form of epidemic diseases. So Australia is a perfect / terrible example of this. Terrible in the sense that millions of people die, good in the sense that it is pretty cut and dry, how it's like the Americas. So we do have overseas exploration, explorers by British guys like James Cook. James Cook is then eaten by cannibals someplace, I think, in Hawaii, or I can't remember where. I'm not going to slander any cannibal groups today on this channel. So we do see that in Australia, this is the reason why it's most similar to the Americas, is because Australia mostly uncontacted with Europe until the 1700s. And then guess what Europeans bring? Well, they bring diseases like influenza and diseases like smallpox and other things like that. And because of this exposure of diseases to places like Australia, we do see a decline in the indigenous population, much like we did in the Americas. So horrible, horrible consequences and results, but we do see that that is why it's most similar to the Americas. But Australia is a good example of a white dominion colony. There is still obviously an Aboriginal population. It's still around today, but the problems, however, that we'll kind of talk about later is that they will have reservations basically for Aboriginal people. They're horrible living conditions even to this day. There hasn't really been any improvement in the lives of Aboriginal people for quite some time. But we do see that the kind of population of Australia is going to become slowly more European as time goes on. We do see that it originally is used as a penal colony, meaning it's a dumping ground for prisoners. But then guess what? Non-prisoners are going to come and live there too after they discover gold. So again, why am I mentioning Australia? Australia is most similar to the Americas during the 1500s. All right, last place on this list today, New Zealand. New Zealand is a good example of actual resistance from Indigenous people against European powers. And the big group that is going to resist the British there are the Maori. The Maori are not going to have complete independence. We do see white settlers being introduced into New Zealand. But thanks to kind of the military standoff that will happen, actually, because of the Maori and their guerrilla warfare, we do see there will be kind of more self-government for Maori in their specific areas of New Zealand. So New Zealand, example of some indigenous resistance to the European, I should say the British presence. It's also the first place to grant women the right to vote. Anyway, how are the British trying to promote their economic influence in Asia during the age of imperialism? The most obvious answer is the building of colonies. And what is the impact of Britain on places like Oceania? All right, that is all for today. Have a grand and blessed evening, afternoon, morning, or 3 a.m. whenever you're watching this. Please don't watch this at 3 a.m. Have a grand old day. God bless.